Good evening to everyone. Schönen guten Abend allerseits und herzlich willkommen zur Sitzung oder zur Diskussion des Israel Study Center Vienna. Welcome to everyone to our meeting of the Israel Studies Center Vienna this evening on this topic of vaccinations and the politics thereof in Israel and in Austria. We have a very fine panel of speakers to talk with us today about these issues. Yael Hashiloni-Dolev from Tel Aviv and Katharina from Vienna, and the discussion will be moderated by Barbara Prainsack of the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna. Just a word before we begin about the nature of this organization. The Israel Study Center is an independent organization, not affiliated with any religious or secular organization, dedicated to advancing public awareness of what is going on in Israel from multiple academic perspectives. In other words, primarily a scholarly organization, but not one that is limited to the scholarly arena, but rather acting in the public sphere. We have support from very many organizations for which we are very grateful, but we act independently, as I just said. While people continue to come into the program, I nonetheless would like to pass the leadership of this session on to the person who is supposed to have it, Barbara Prainsack. Please take over.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mitch, the president of the Center for Israel Studies Vienna. We are running online discussions, seminars on various topics within the remit of the center. Today is a very topical theme, namely vaccination programs in Israel and Austria. And before I introduce our speakers, I will say that one of the reasons for us to do this is that Israel and Austria are often seen or portrayed as opposite ends of the scale. Vaccination policies and programs are often seen as exact opposites of each other, and differences are emphasized. And we think that whereas there are a lot of differences, there are also some commonalities, and we will try today to get to a more nuanced understanding of what goes on in terms of vaccination policies in Israel and in Austria. And we will also ask the question of who's left behind. So I'm very, very happy that we have two fantastic speakers today. Both of them, I'm happy that we got them tonight because their expertise is very much sought after. So Katharina will be speaking also at an event in the Burgtheater on vaccination policy in Austria and in Europe. There was a big interview with her today in the Standard, in the Austrian newspaper, the Standard. Yael is in a similar situation in Israel. So we are really, really happy that you could make the time to be here with us tonight. Professor Yael Hashiloni-Dolev is based at the Ben Gurion University of the Negev. She's a sociologist of health and illness. She has also done really pioneering comparative work, looking at genetic counseling in Israel and Germany. She has done a lot of work setting new agendas for comparative work. She is also a former member of the Israel's National Council on Bioethics. And on the topic, she is also a member of Israel's Vaccination Prioritization Committee. So welcome, Yael, and thank you very much for being with us tonight. Dr. Katharina Paul also actually studied in Israel. Part of her studies were done at the Tel Aviv University. Her PhD is from the University of Amsterdam. She has been a member of the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna since 2013. She's, I can say that without exaggeration, she's Austria's foremost expert on a vaccination policy. She's now doing a program long before the before vaccination policy was becoming such a topical issue, she was doing research on vaccination policy and is currently working on a project funded by the Austrian Science Fund. I will now ask Katharina and Yael in this order to give us a brief overview of vaccination programs and the status quo in Austria and Israel. We will then have the opportunity to discuss together with everyone here, and we will end around 7:15. And yeah, so I look forward to the presentations and the discussions. And over to you, Katharina. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to the Center for the very kind invitation. And thank you, Barbara, for the extremely generous words of introduction. You're right about one thing, and that's the fact that I've been interested in vaccination for a long time now, and that many of the problems that now appear to be so new are in fact old problems to me. And I think that's maybe one of the things I want to share with you tonight. So indeed, I think I've been asked many times in the past few months and weeks, why is Israel so fast? Why is Austria so slow? What's happening in the European Union? And I think pace or speed of the rollout of the campaign isn't the only interesting thing here. It's also about the quality of the rollout, or the quality of the programs, I think, is something we need to be talking about more than the speed. And the questions that Barbara has provided us as sort of food for thought are what works, what doesn't work, and who gets left behind. And I want to just raise some issues that I've been thinking about recently. So first off, and this is of course the first thing that comes to mind when people think about vaccination, is vaccine hesitancy. So the tendency for some parents to delay vaccines or to reject vaccines altogether. And this in Austria is a persistent issue that has also shaped their national immunization program, which is of course, which provides vaccines free at the point of care, but still, the past few decades, we've seen an increasing trend of vaccine hesitancy and even skepticism in Austria, much like in other European countries. And this is maybe also why in earlier phases of the pandemic, policymakers and the sort of also media discourse was focusing very heavily on
somebody muted Katharina now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope it wasn't getting too boring just yet. So this persistent issue of vaccine hesitancy is maybe why policymakers and generally discourse on vaccination in the pandemic was so heavily focused on vaccine hesitancy, as if, policymakers were almost expecting people to reject any and all vaccines that were to be licensed. And so there was this really heavy focus, this excessive focus, I think, on hesitancy. And now we actually see in the past few weeks that willingness to get vaccinated is increasing in Austria. And so there's a very positive, I think, trend towards vaccine acceptance. And of course, this has also grown, I think, with the availability of vaccines. Of course, I mean, there are, smaller issues there we can talk about later on. But I think one question that's interesting here is what this actually means for vaccine uptake on the long run. So also when we think about childhood immunizations, where we see hesitancy when it comes to the measles vaccine and these very basic immunizations, then I think that's also something that shouldn't be hidden away behind this very strong focus on COVID-19, because clearly that's not the only vaccine that's really needed globally. So I think decision makers are now gradually catching up in Austria with more systemic issues, so moving a little bit away from vaccine hesitancy as a sole focus and focusing more on what needs to be done to make this vaccine available. And besides actually getting the vaccine and getting it funded and rolled out in Austria, of course, there's the issue of who gets the vaccine, when and how and where. So the question of prioritization. And so I've looked at the prioritization schedules, as I'm sure many of us have done. And of course, it's quite similar to those of other EU countries, focusing, in the first instance on the elderly and nursing homes, so very critical sites where vaccination is urgently needed. And but what's interesting in Austria, I think, is that there is, on the one hand, one centralized vaccination schedule for the whole country, but then there's also more fine-grained prioritization schedules in local states, in the 9 federal states that that constitute Austria. And I think that on the one hand, federalism, so this decentralized nature of things, which is quite different from Israel, I think, complicates things, because you have to you can see actually from the schedules that clearly different groups and interests and concerns are being satisfied in these prioritization schedules, in these local ones. On the other hand, and I think to give the benefit of the doubt, it's also this decentralization allows us, I think, to tailor vaccination schedules according to local needs. So local communities and their ways of living, religious communities. If we know that in particular regions, people tend to go to church a lot, or collect or gather in large groups, then I think that requires maybe a different approach from when we think about Vienna as a very densely populated city. So here, this issue of decentralization is really sort of a key feature of Austria in any case. And this leads me to the next issue I wanted to raise, which is the question about inequalities. And I think Yael will be speaking about this later on. Barbara asked us to think about who gets left behind. And I have a short answer and a long answer to this regarding Austria. One answer is really that we know very little about who gets left behind, because the data is of very poor quality in Austria. So this is not a new issue. So I'm not only talking about COVID-19 here, because I think there it's even more clear who's getting left behind in a sense, because people are talking about it more. But when we think about childhood immunizations, we know little about why some segments of the populations may not be receiving the vaccines that they need. So whether this is hesitancy or basically systemic issues such as in not being able to reach particular groups in society is something we don't know in Austria. So clearly people are getting left behind, and we don't know who these people are and why they're getting left behind or why they're difficult to reach. So here, this issue of data, I think, is another key feature of the national immunization program, which I think sets it apart from Israel, really. So, and more specifically, I think just to make this more clear, but what I'm talking about here is that Austria lacks what is known as a central vaccination registry or vaccine registry, which is basically a database where one records who gets vaccinated, where, when, by whom. And this can be used on the one hand to monitor vaccine uptake in a particular country or a region. It can also be used to assess effectiveness and efficacy of vaccines, and to kind of monitor developments on the long run as well. And so this kind of database is lacking in Austria. And instead, what has happened here is that, every federal state of the 9 states has been kind of doing their own thing in the national immunization program, because it is because it's something that is within their remit, actually. So this has led to a certain fragmentation, I think, in Austria, which people were well aware of and suddenly became evident when the pandemic arrived. And so that explains, I think, some of the delays in being able to react and respond to the pandemic effectively, and also some of the delays in rolling out, as it were, the vaccine. So basically this means that, prioritization may well be thought through and fair and even just, but implementation is something different. And also this lack of data, of course, minimizes, I think, transparency. So people get the sense now that it is a bit intransparent who gets vaccinated and why and how. And I'm not only speaking about the mayors of small towns who jumped the queue, as it were, and got vaccinated first, but talking about broader issues about different groups in society. And we've seen, I think, in the past couple of weeks that this is really, I think there's a growing sense of distribution being unjust and unfair and people getting left behind. And I think it's getting a bit exacerbated, to be honest, in the media, but I think it's nonetheless important to kind of monitor these sentiments, really. So I mentioned this issue of data, and maybe just to add to that, these issues aren't new, of course, but now what we see is sort of technological fixes to address this problem. So there's an electronic vaccination pass, which could be turned into this green pass that many people are talking about now. And there's also this increasing use of dashboards where you get a sense of control as a citizen, right? So you can look at this website of the Ministry of Health and you see how many vaccines have been administered on a particular day. And I think this is interesting in what it does what it does, it gives you the sense that you can hold the institutions accountable for what they're doing and how many vaccines they're delivering. But still, I think even these dashboards and the electronic vaccination pass are really concealing some of the messiness of the Austrian vaccination program. So it's a messy program, and not only in a bad way, because it just means it's decentralized and a lot of local practices featuring, but also it's just there's a lot of stuff we don't know. So it's sort of gaps basically in knowledge still. I think maybe I'll end here and just mention again that transparency is really, I think, a concern in the public eye, and this not just in a technical way, in not being able to see what's going on, but also I think it's symptomatic of a broader, deep-rooted political issue. So the unwillingness of institutions to be transparent about what they do, and the impossibility of properly monitoring what institutions are doing and how public money is being spent, if you like. So I think this issue of transparency is something that, of course, is an issue for other policy areas too. And in this sense, I think the COVID-19 crisis and the current discourse on it could be a vehicle through which I think citizens can ask for more transparency, even more participation, more of a say in how things are done, and also questioning what we know and what we don't know about vaccination programs, I think. So I think I'll leave it there. All right, that's okay.
Thanks very much, Katharina. So your diagnosis is very much one of the COVID-19 vaccination situation being a reflection of some of the key features of Austrian democracy and federalism, and also particularly Austrian problem with transparency. So Yael, is the same thing true for Israel, that the Israeli vaccination program is illustrating some of the key features of the Israeli system? You have to switch on your microphone.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for the invitation and for the kind introduction. And I will try answering your question quickly. I think that the COVID is illustrative of the Israeli situation in many respects, but the vaccines are the good part. While many other parts of this whole situation are bringing out very problematic the problems of the Israeli society, the vaccines are in a way the hope. Because it's not, of course, there are problems which I will talk about, but it is working quite well. And I've picked a few issues to talk about, and I will try to tell you about what's going on. I must say that the data changes every day. So I wrote down a few things 3 days ago, and today I had to update a lot. And I will try to be brief, but if I'm too long, stop me and we discuss openly, okay, later on. So first of all, I think that from outside it might seem like a magic that everybody is vaccinated and we're forgetting about the pandemic. This is not the situation at all. It takes time, it's long, and it's not really possible to stop it completely. You know, there are many millions of children who are not vaccinated. And despite the fact that 90% of the eligible Israelis have either received 2 shots or at least 1 shot, it's not over yet. And as long as the world is global, and I hope it will stay this way or will open up again, it's not really possible to close the borders forever. So it's not done or over yet. About responsiveness or hesitancy. So usually the Israeli public accepts vaccines quite well. And also when it started, the program started out in Israel, there were worries that there will be a lot of hesitancy. And at the beginning, it didn't really happen because the elderly really wanted to be vaccinated. And at the beginning, there was a high demand. But there are groups that are not taking the inoculation as much as others. The more hesitant groups are the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, the Arabs, and also the former Soviet Union citizens. And interestingly, it's a reverse picture of how the virus actually affected different communities, because the community which was most severely hurt is the ultra-Orthodox. 1% of the people over 60 in this community died, which is very high compared to the general population, which is 1 in 350. But the interesting fact is that they're not getting vaccinated as much. And also fear of death was also something that was studied. And it's interesting, they have the lowest fear of death, while the Arabs have the highest fear of death. But both groups are not as responsive as others. What can explain that? All the three groups, also the former Soviet Union citizens, are generally distrustful of the state. And it seems that the groups that were always distrustful are also distrustful of the vaccination. Other reasons could be among the ultra-Orthodox, for example, that many were sick and were sick already and recovered, and they're not documented as such because they didn't want to report that they're sick. So we don't really know why they don't take the vaccination. Other reasons can be not enough reaching out. Some populations, it's harder for them to reach the centers. And all the rest of the reasons, like in the rest of the world, fake news, fear of side effects, distrust of the pharma industry, conspiracy theory, and also the idea that we are lab rats in Israel because of Pfizer experiment in Israel. About priorities, I think priorities are really interesting to compare because in Israel, the principle for vaccine distribution was mainly age and health problems, health conditions. The elderly went first and the chronically ill. It's interesting that, for example, teachers were not prioritized and schools were closed. I have a 13-year-old son, my youngest son. He has not visited school for a year, only for very, very few days here and there. So I understand that in other countries, there are other priorities, and I think that's interesting. It took time, but non-citizens were also provided vaccination. Asylum seekers, the city of Tel Aviv had a program to vaccinate them without threatening them with the immigration authorities. But there is a group who is left behind, and it's not very hard to guess. Those are the Palestinians. While the US Secretary of State reminded Israel of its obligation to the Palestinians as an occupying power, according to the Fourth Geneva Convention, it has the duty to combat contagious diseases and epidemics under its rule. But this did not take place, and actually the vaccination program for Palestinians was postponed again and again, and it started today. So that's the changing news. I think the good news is that finally vaccination is provided to some Palestinians. And who are those Palestinians? The one working in Israel or in Israeli settlements in the West Bank. So unused vaccines bought from Moderna and not used, I think, because of the contract with Pfizer. So they're allocated 220,000 Palestinians. But the background logic of this initiative is not really humanitarian, it is egoistic. It is the ones who are in touch, in contact with mainly Israeli citizens, Jewish and Arab, or Jews in the West Bank. And epidemiologically, this is not very wise, because of course, I'm not talking now ethically, I'm talking epidemiologically, those populations are mixed. So I find it, let's say, interesting that they're not giving vaccines. What about enforcing vaccination? So now the question is how to handle people who did not get inoculated. And there are some demands to force vaccination on workers, but I don't think it will be possible under the Israeli law. But there are demands, for example, for teachers to enter school only if they're vaccinated, recovered from the disease, or 74 hours post a negative test. Of course, this is not unique to Israel. The right to autonomy is challenged by public health considerations and even educational rights of children, because schools are all the time repeatedly closing because of one sick child, one sick teacher. But again, from public health experts' point of view, it is a question: is it clever to force vaccination, or will it be harmful in the long run? First of all, for the uptake or future resentment of anti-vaccination once you force it. And the other reason is, again, epidemiological. It is not clear that for example, young people, children who are going to recover very easily with very high chances of no side effects and no problems, it might be better for themselves and for the population that they don't get the vaccine. So there's a question around it. Is it biologically wiser that not all the population is vaccinated? And then future mutations might have to face different, diverse immune mechanisms that are not all the same. I must tell you that just something personal, I'm really eager to go back to teaching in class. I haven't seen a student face-to-face in a year now, and I made a poll in my Zoom lesson, and I was really surprised to find out that only 3% of my students in a class of 130 students, so that's quite a large sample, only 3% were not vaccinated or ill before. And they also said that they're hesitant, but they might go. A few last words about violations of bioethical and political norms. So in Israel, the government protocols concerning the pandemic were sealed for 30 years, and that's very worrying. There was a law allowing the Krankenkasses, the health Kupot Cholim, to share medical information of patients with non-medical authorities. So privacy is hurt, and that is, of course, without patients' consent. The contract with Pfizer itself is confidential. It's actually blackened. It was on the news everywhere. We don't know what's inside it. And surveillance in Israel, as far as I know, Israel is the only country in the world that uses its secret agency to carry out surveillance, which was, by the way, very unproductive. It just didn't work well.
Yael, can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that for those who haven't followed this? When you say surveillance, what kind of surveillance are you talking about?
With cellular, with the mobile phones. So the secret agency of Israel, which usually uses those techniques to trace what is called terrorists. So the same technologies were used tracing the public, the Israeli public, but it wasn't working very well. I'm talking now about practical matters. So if you had your neighbor was sick, but there was a wall between you, the program couldn't differentiate, and then you would have to be isolated 2 weeks. And there were many problems. It wasn't as effective. So first of all, I think it's problematic from human rights point of view. But the interesting thing is that it was problematic only also from the practical side. It wasn't magic. And it, of course, invaded privacy and gave, I think, the wrong authorities a power to take care of public health. One last thing I wanted to mention is the question of the Pfizer agreement. So there's a big question in Israel. Is it a medical experiment, what we're going through? And the Helsinki Committee is an independent body monitoring the ethics of medical experiments. And the Israeli High Helsinki Committee is criticizing the contract Israel has signed with Pfizer. And but now going on there. But we do know that Israel buys vaccines, gives Pfizer medical data. What kind of data? Sealed. We don't know. How well is the data anonymized, de-identified? What can be inferred from it? We don't know. We also don't know, for example, how much it's worth financially. And there is a theoretical and regulatory dispute whether what is going on is a medical clinical research or is it what they call a post-marketing analysis, which is different, and then it's regulated differently. I must tell you that I was very trustful in the sense that, of course, I got vaccinated, but the fact that parts of the contract are confidential is not a very nice feeling. So on one hand, if compared to Austria, there is a lot of data, patients in Israel. And it's very centralized, and that is also very productive. But the other side of it is there is also a darker side to having so much data and not knowing exactly how it's handled.
Thank you so much. And before I ask one more question of each of you, and then we open for discussion, I want to ask one question to you, Yael, about what you just said about the Pfizer deal. So to recapitulate, there was an agreement, which is, as you said, secret, between, was it between the Kupot Cholim and Pfizer, or the state and Pfizer?
No, the state, the health ministry.
The health ministry, about data of individual patients in some sort of aggregated form that was handed over as part of the deal, as part of the payment. And you mentioned that the Helsinki Committee might not approve it. So, but it has already been handed over, the data, right? So does the Helsinki Committee have any power here to stop anything from happening?
Okay, so I can't, I'm not certain. This is so complicated legally, so don't take my word for granted. But as I understand it, they can't stop. I mean, the government can give the information. What can the Helsinki Committee do? But it does cause problems with regulation, even in the States, with the FDA. So, of course, also the FDA can start a new rule and say, we don't care, you know. But that's the slippery slope of the pandemic. Many things have been done, you know, that were formerly not done. and how will this proceed? It's very hard to tell. The problem is that there is such a mix-up between political resistance and if you say that you're against the blackened contract with the company, so immediately you're blamed that you're against vaccines and you're a denier of science, which you're not. You know, so and then also people who resent the government, people really, it's impossible to differentiate, and the distrust I find very problematic.
Thank you very much. The question that I wanted to ask from both of you is, there are various ideas, and in the case of Israel, already rollouts of vaccine certificates, or vaccination certificates rather, that then give people access to, in the Israeli case, restaurants and bars and other public spaces. And in Austria, as part of what the European Union is envisaging, a similar certificate, a similar green passport is planned to be rolled out. What is the status quo in each country of the actual rollout of the plans, and what is the public opinion there? Is there are there any critical voices in Israel about the fact that some people cannot get vaccinated and they are still excluded? In Austria, is a discussion about that. So could I ask Katharina to answer first, and then Yael?
Yeah, thank you. Gail, thank you for this brilliant talk and for sharing all these impressions from Israel. I think it's really, really helpful and instructive. And I recognize what you were saying about conflating criticism of particular practices with criticism of vaccines or, related things. I think that's an ancient thing basically, and it's really becoming very, very evident now. So regarding your question, Barbara, about vaccination certificates, this interestingly enough is being, I think, developed at the level of the European Union. So this is, I think, something that. So I think the idea was here already basically a year ago, that at some point we would have these vaccination certificates, and the people I've spoken to in my research as people who work in the system were very confident early on the pandemic that we would have these technologies at some point. So these vaccination certificates, and this would make things so much easier. And there was very little regard for the potential ethical conflicts actually that this would create. So I find it fascinating that people think very much in technical terms and feasibility of technologies rather than their implications. But from what I understand, this is not being designed at the level of member states at the moment, but it's really something that the European Commission is envisaging in a sense, also in this spirit of having an interoperable health system, because if each country kind of does their own thing, it will be difficult, I think, for them to work together. So I think it's something that actually the Commission President von der Leyen, along with probably a few individual decision makers in the EU, invoked as a new idea, almost stating it in a fact-like matter. So I found that disturbing, really, to be quite honest. So apart from the practical issues, much like you were saying, Yael, there are, of course, a lot of ethical questions around these certificates and practical questions also. I mean, what does immunity even mean at this point? We don't really know, right? So, I mean, there's another element of not knowing. So for those lucky ones who have been vaccinated, they also don't know how long they will be immune and what that means individually and more collectively. So that's the status of it in Austria. There isn't this certificate yet, but I think decision makers are invoking it as if it were being designed at the moment and as if it were to be introduced in a few weeks from now, which I think is impossible for different reasons.
Thank you. Yael.
So we have a certificate, but I must say that I haven't used it yet. And that my general feeling is that when it's not work, when it's not that people are denied their right for work, it's very, very hard to enforce. And I have a feeling that it will just sort of disappear. because Israel has so many children, and then how can you separate families in many different places? And then, thank God, we have good weather, so you can sit outside and the restaurants are full again and everybody is sitting outside. And people are not obedient. I think that part of what the pandemic showed is that people after a whole year, they're really fed up. They're fed up also because the rules have been changing so quickly and flipping from side to side. And Israel, the citizens were never too obedient. But also in other countries, you can see that people just don't follow the rules anymore. So actually, I must say that I think of it in practical matters, and my guess is that it won't hold on for long. Maybe in special places. I mean, if you want to go to a gym and the gym doesn't let you in, and that's their decision, then it will work. Or maybe in airplanes, but the rest I can't really see. And at work, it's not legal. You know,
So yeah, you're saying you think it will no longer be enforced, or it will just no longer be required?
I think they will not be able to enforce it, and then they will have to give up, because you know, in order to enforce something, you don't shoot citizens who disagree. You don't take them to jail for those reasons. So I think that what we saw in the pandemic is that governments need. We knew it always, but you need the agreement of the public, unless it's really a dictatorship, you know, and if the public doesn't follow, so it's very hard. You know, in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox were studying in school while all the rest of the country was not. So what was shown very clearly in the last year is that if you're a strong minority, you can really oppose the government. So I don't see cops really, what will they do? Give fines? So now they cancel already fines that were given for people who didn't wear masks or in the street. Or I don't see how it's really going to work. Maybe as a transitional phase, you know, but
that's interesting. So while Europe is thinking of introducing it, Israel is considering to extradite it.
No,
Thank you
I
very
don't
much.
think it's not that Israel is considering it. It's just my guess of how it will be practically, what will happen practically.
Thank you so much to both of you. So we have questions already, and we have one question from Petra Bayer. Petra, would you like to ask it, or should I read it? I can also read it. Okay, so Petra is asking, what roles does the 5th parliamentary election within 2 years in Israel, what role does that play for the speed of vaccination in Israel? And are there any explanations for this, for the high 7-day incidence numbers, despite the high number of people vaccinated already, the high proportion of people vaccinated already?
So the political situation, what can I say? It depends on your point of view, and some people see it as an example for why the Israeli prime minister is second only to God, and some people see it as a horrible misuse, and you know, and a terrible. The ones who resent Bibi are against, but that's the problem. It's not against the vaccination. It's against how it's used politically, because the way it is sold is not as a success of the state, which is built on a long history of a health system that had its problems, but also had a lot of good sides. So it is marketed as a real personal achievement. And that, of course, makes some people adore the Prime Minister, some people resent him even more. And also distrustful, because the thing is now everything is open again. And people are all the time asking themselves, is this for health reasons? Is it really time for that? Or is it all political because the elections are coming again? And it's good to free the citizens before elections. And it depends who you ask.
Thank you.
I answered this question, but I tried.
Thank you, Yael. We have one question by Gerda. Would you like to ask your question, Gerda? Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Fine,
Yes.
great. Thank you for the excellent presentations. Very, very interesting. My question is about potential judicialization. Could the courts become a highly relevant arena for fighting about vaccination policies in both countries? Why in Israel? It seems that actually data protection, which is also a kind of human rights in many quarters. So this might actually then become a matter in international courts, if not national ones. On the other hand, in Austria, my feeling is that in recent weeks, at the latest, there were problems about equal treatment of people in the prioritization for vaccination. You may have heard that even university employees were affected in a positive manner because there was a window of opportunity to inscribe for vaccinations, but that the universities are in distance learning, and there is other people like physiotherapists who seem in the city of Vienna not managed to get on the lists of prioritization. And also people with very high risks are oftentimes not yet vaccinated. And so this ended in a saying by the responsible person of the city of Vienna that 5,000 vaccinations for some young university people, we don't mind that, that's no problem. However, on the other hand, there might be 5,000 people who run much higher risks and who have to be with many people all the time. So my feeling is that people could go to the courts and might have good reasons for that. What is your impression? Thank you.
Really interesting question. Thank you. Katharina, could you go first?
Thank you, Gerda Falkner, for this question. So interestingly, courts, have been a site for vaccination debates in the past. So when you think about liability for new vaccines and so that sorry, I can't think of the technical term actually, but people have of course gone to courts and trying to prove that a vaccine was administered to a child or an adult even and caused harm or even death in some cases. So courts are actually important sites, I think. Maybe that's the term Barbara is suggesting, indemnification. Thank you. I think it's indemnification. But so courts have been a relevant site in the past for vaccination debates. I think there's a whole literature on it actually, which I should look at. So thank you for pointing me in this direction too. And I do think for the time for now, I think, yes, I see increasing appeal to the need to kind of seek justice and ensure fair treatment by going to the courts. I'm not sure that's the most effective way of going about things, but my impression would be that these appeals would lead to a reform of the general political conditions, the institutional conditions, to prevent unfair treatment. So, and I think this is less about the university employees and more so about, for example, mayors skipping the line when it comes to but yes, I mean, I think this sense of being treated unfairly is an important signal that we need to really observe, I think, in Austrian society at the moment. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but it's given me food for thought for sure.
So Yael, what about the situation in Israel? Have there been people who went to courts because of some harms that they claimed?
That I know about the vaccines, and the political turmoil in Israel is so large at the moment. So there have been appeals to court about the tracing, about privacy. I think about the data. There are, but not. I don't think that specifically about the vaccines. Not that I know of. About the fact that the borders are closed. There are so many issues hurting in a way human rights or privacy or citizen rights that the vaccine is not on the top of the list. But I think that in case, workplaces try to deny people their work, or then of course the people will go to court, and it can't be done very easily. They would really have to change the law. They can't just deny people's right for work. But there's more about data, about medical data, what they can do with it. As I told you, the local authorities are getting information about people. So this was an issue lately, and the fact that the airport is closed, and of course who is being entered and who is not, who is allowed to enter and who is not, and issues like that. But that's not so much vaccines.
Thanks very much. We had a question by Ashling. Would you like to ask it yourself, or should I read it?
Yeah, sure, I can ask. Thanks to you both for really, really interesting presentations. I just had a quick question in relation to the Israeli approach and the data sharing issues. I just wondered about the public response to the data sharing in Israel. If you could say anything on the general public response, and in particular the discussions, if there was any around individuals at a public level desire or ability to opt out of the data sharing in the vaccine context, and the privacy concerns, especially the local authority issues you mentioned a few moments ago.
So there is some opposition, but it's not very strong. And I think part of it is because the political situation is so problematic. The public is resenting, some parts of the public are uprising against so many issues. So of course that not everybody is happy with the data sharing. And some, but that's not the main public issue in Israel today.
But could you summarize the main points of the debate on this, Yael, or has this not been? I mean, is this? I ask very bluntly: is this something that academics worry about and data protection nerds, or is this something that is more in the mainstream?
It's mixed. I think it's a mixture of groups. Part of the groups are academics worrying about privacy, human rights, and all the regular issues. But the other groups are the skeptics, and it goes together, and that's the mixture I was talking about. It goes together with the total distrust of everything. Some people use it with conspiracy theories, with saying, we're lab rats, which I find, a bit exaggerated. But so there are those. They're not really coalitions, but there are different groups from different perspectives which argue against it. And then there's the supporters of the government who think that we have the best government in the world, and that the prime minister is so shrewd and clever and manages everything. And why are the others bitter leftists or academics complaining all the time. So that's, I think, the division.
Very interesting. Thank you. Gabriele, you had a question.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. I still have a question to this issue because I was wondering, it's always said there are data which Pfizer got, but you mentioned that nobody really knows what kind of data these are, no? Am I right? Because when you look up the paper which recently came out with those data, everybody's citing it now. It's in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Mm-hmm.
The authors all from Israeli or Harvard, either academic institutions or Clalit, or so. I was really wondering, what did Pfizer really get?
The question
because
is
Israel
why
also paid.
why is it confidential if it's not problematic at all? And there's a lot of open data. You know, there's a lot of data that the health ministry publishes all the time, and health ministries all over the world publish a lot of aggregated data about, you know, the pandemic. So I don't really know. The question is, why is it sealed? Why governmental protocols about the pandemic are sealed for 30 years? That's very worrying, I think. And what's confidential about it?
I think from a perspective of Austrians who are very, very concerned about data protection, it's a very interesting scenario that I think would play out very differently in Austria. Katharina, you please, and then we have another question for, yeah.
Sorry, I'm just basically, you know, thinking about this sort of political economy of data. I think that is emerging in this crisis because, you know, while you know there are critics of the whole world is basically reliant on this data emerging. So I think there's really interesting asymmetry here. And there's a discrepancy between this and, on the other hand, the open science movement that has really shaped the pandemic in significant ways. So in the early phases of, you know, sequencing and so on, and all of that is being shared, you know, very quickly and smoothly. And so I think there's, you know, there isn't, you know, one would think that there's sort of this spirit of global cooperation, international cooperation, but really it's not only between states and the governments and decision makers, it's between pharmaceutical companies, manufacturers, and global organizations. I think it's really fascinating and something that has not been problematized so much, I think, in these comparisons and races between countries and, you know, the joint race against the virus and so on. So I think those are really interesting points.
But, you know, I must reply to what Barbara said about the Austrians' suspicion about data sharing and so on. I think that the Israelis are in a way very cynical. You can hear a lot of people say, this is too late. Privacy is totally gone. You know, whether we like it or not, it's gone.
But
So I don't think it's that they support it. It's in a way giving up, you know.
But I think Katharina was drawing attention to another very interesting dimension, which is that maybe not globally, but certainly in the rich world, people will benefit from the Israeli data. And at the same time, people say, oh, those Israelis, they can't get the data protection right. Which reminds me of 20 years ago, the embryonic stem cell debates, where the Germans said, we are not going to harvest stem cells on German soil. And the Israelis are immoral. And then they ended up importing cell lines from Israel so they could do stem cell research in Germany. So it's a bit of that hypocrisy in the debate going on at the moment, which is something that Katharina was drawing attention.
But let me put it from the Israeli point of view. If all the world is benefiting, why aren't the citizens of Israel getting any compensation for it? You know, it's our bodies, and the state of Israel paid. It also, did it pay a lot of money for the vaccines? Did it not? Do citizens have the right to know what was done with their money, with their bodies? And when it's mixed up with private entrepreneurship or private pharma, pharma industry. So.
Yael, we have another question for you. Monica asks, why would or could the Palestinian Authority not buy and distribute vaccines independently?
In Gaza or in the West Bank? I don't think it's exactly the same situation. But in Gaza, I think it was banned by Israel. It's used as a weapon. But I'm not 100% sure, because this is the explanation, but it's not that they can just go and buy freely on the international market. If it was this way, then they would be an independent country. And as you see, there is a lot of resentment in Israel. People say that we should use it to get things, I lost the word, chatufim. The soldiers, the hostages, right? So, or that if you give it to them, that it will go only to the terrorist leaders. This is not my point of view, but it's not that they can just go and also they're very poor. The question is, are they allowed to get donations? Because there are countries which want to donate. It's not just that they're not allowed to buy. They're also, the borders are controlled. That's the whole idea.
And Katharina, I suppose that the Palestinian Authority is also not part of COVAX because they can't, right? Okay.
And I think that the Palestinians in the West Bank are getting some Russian vaccinations, or they're given some, but there is a high percentage of sick people now in the West Bank, so they are in trouble now.
On this rather depressing note, we do still have about 10 minutes for questions and comments. Anything that colleagues here would like to ask or comment? Katharina, of course, please.
Yael, just a couple of days ago, we had a brief conversation and you mentioned the role of these historical institutions. I think something like mother-baby clinics or public health institutions. And I think that's something really interesting because that is also left out of the discourse on the Israeli system at the moment. Could you tell us a little more about those?
In Israel, from before the state was formed, there was, it started, I think, with women's organizations. There is like a separate organization called Tipat Chalab. It's a drop of milk. And this organization is historically taking care of newborns and their mothers. And the whole vaccination program is controlled by it. So when you have a baby, you're monitored. It's been very equally distributed, and for years it was very successful. In the babies' rates of survival were very, very high in Israel for a long time, because the system worked very well. And I think it's the socialist system from long ago, and so it's really been together with the sick funds and with how the whole system is organized. Israel medically is doing well in that sense. Of course, there's also criticism about, you know, you always need more money for health, but also if you compare death rates from COVID in Israel, and even if you control for age, the numbers are lower than in many other countries with advanced systems. And that's also a question. Were the hospitals working better? And I think probably yes.
We have one question from our president. Mitch, please.
Yes, this is a question for Yael, but in a certain sense, it's also for both of you. It's a question about data sharing, but not with private industry. There have been discussions in Europe about researchers' access to health-related data that have already been gathered by states. And there are restrictions on that sort of access almost everywhere. They're not in Scandinavia, apparently, or at least less so. My question, I feel an urge to be a bit polemical here in the sense that shouldn't we all want this data to be used for the public good? But the question then becomes, does that mean that any scientist should have the right to access this data just because they think research in general benefits the public good and maybe the rest of the population doesn't agree? This is more of a question of research policy than it is about vaccination policy, but the vaccination issue is a subset, shall we say, of this, because it has to do with what the state does with its data. So I wonder what you think about that. This is really a question about what scientists ought to be able to do.
Thank you. Yael, do you want to answer first, and then
I will answer,
and then
quickly.
Katharina, and then we will wrap up. Thank you.
So I don't think this is really being polemical. This is really right to the point. This is a very, very important issue nowadays. And my point of view, I'm sharing my opinion, is not whether the data should be used, is how. And that's the big question. That's the really big policy question. And you can control it or share it in many, many different ways. And I think it's quite certain that it will be used, but not with blackened confidential contracts, or not without population consent, or, you know, and even not without giving back, I think, money. Does it belong to where should the money earned go to? Should it go, for example, to the state, to the health system of the state, to people who, you know, there's so many questions how to regulate it.
Katharina, thank you, Yael. Katharina?
Yeah, I mean, I can only reiterate what Yael said. It would be in everyone's interest to share this data more effectively, and it's not the case in Austria. Some of this data is actually there, and it's sort of hidden away in drawers and databases hidden away somewhere. And I think sometimes the state doesn't have so much of an interest in giving researchers access to this, because some of the knowledge that we may obtain from this data is inconvenient, because it may reveal that some policies actually are not working out that well. Maybe vaccination policy is one of them, we don't really know, but I could, you know, for other social policy areas as well. And so I think Austria, I think to conclude maybe on a note of, you know, where Austria and Israel actually do meet, I think there are strong traditions of public health and of social medicine in both countries. And I think there are a few institutional, legal issues, regulatory issues in Austria that hamper, I think, the development of the full potential, I think, of the system in rolling out the vaccine and creating more equality. I think there's lots to be learned, basically, from Israel regarding these institutions and also regarding research policy. And of course, as we all know, Israel has a very strong research policy and research output. And that is certainly something I think that Austrian policymakers actually have looked at in the past few years, I think, trying also to find more cooperations with Israeli researchers. And well, let's hope it continues this way. If
I may just follow up briefly, actually to both of you, but first of all to Katharina, the way you formulated the issue makes one think that the government actually knows that where its data is, and that therefore they're capable of hiding it. Is that the case? Is that really the case?
Yeah, I think you put it very well. I think it is not always the case, but that's a finding in itself, right? So if you don't look for the data, you have the data, but you don't look for the data. That's also leaving it somewhere, leaving it hidden away. It's not actively hiding it, but it's also not looking for it. So the different ways of not knowing, of course, and not wanting to know.
Which takes us back to the structural issues that we began with. If centralization doesn't actually work, then data can also be lost.
So thank you both very much, and thank you for everyone who participated. Maybe in a few months' time, it would be very interesting to have a similar event where we can then see how things developed and continue to draw out important parallels and important differences. I think they have become very clear, as well as to what extent the current issues around vaccination programs and the successes are also reflections of structural features of both countries. So thank you. I think I'm supposed to give the word back to our president for an announcement of the next event. Is that correct?
I would prefer to let our executive secretary or secretary general is what we should call her in English, do that, because I have a name here, but I don't remember the title of the talk. And so I think she is better equipped to do that than I am.
Dina, and also thank you to Dina, a special thank you for organizing everything.
Okay, so thank you all for participating, and thank you to Yael and Katharina and Barbara and Mitch for organizing and for being part of this evening event. Our next lecture will be on the 12th of April. It will be a lecture from Professor Yitzhak Dalnour, and the subject will be the Arabs in Israel, but he already indicated that he will speak a little bit about the outcome of the elections. So it's going to be a very interesting talk about the current political situation in Israel that might change in the next couple of weeks. So I wish you all a lovely evening. Thank you everybody for participating, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.